Most long-term XRP holders don't reach a breaking point because of fear or sudden collapse. They reach it because of emotional exhaustion that builds quietly over time. Sideways movement, slow progress, and repeated small dips create a kind of psychological pressure that is far more draining than dramatic crashes. When price falls sharply, the emotion is intense but short-lived. When price goes nowhere for long stretches, the emotion becomes constant. It sits in the background of daily life, slowly wearing down patience, confidence, and emotional energy. This is the kind of environment that makes people question themselves, not loudly but privately and persistently. Emotional exhaustion changes how the mind interprets information. At first, waiting feels like discipline. Later, it starts to feel like stagnation. The same chart that once looked like accumulation begins to feel like a dead end. News that once felt neutral starts to feel disappointing. Even silence becomes uncomfortable, because the brain wants confirmation that effort and patience are being rewarded. Over time, the mind stops asking, "Is my reasoning still valid?" and starts asking, "How much longer can I tolerate this?" That shift is subtle, but it is where most long-term investors lose their edge. What makes this especially dangerous is that selling during exhaustion feels rational. It doesn't feel like panic. It feels like clarity. It feels like finally letting go of something that has been mentally heavy for too long. There is often a sense of relief attached to the decision, as if closing the position also closes a chapter of uncertainty. But relief is not the same as correctness. Relief simply means the nervous system is no longer under pressure. Markets are fully aware of this human tendency, and they exploit it not through manipulation but through time. Sideways markets are not neutral environments. They are active psychological filters. They reward those who can manage attention and emotion, and they quietly remove those who cannot. Most people do not exit because they have discovered new, decisive information. They exit because the emotional cost of staying becomes higher than the emotional cost of leaving. This is why emotional exhaustion is more dangerous than fear. Fear can be analyzed. Exhaustion bypasses analysis. As time passes, investors often begin to personalize the waiting. They interpret the lack of movement as a judgment on their intelligence or decision-making. Doubt creeps in not because the asset has changed, but because the individual's emotional reserves have been depleted. Constantly checking price, reading conflicting opinions, and measuring progress in short time frames accelerates this depletion. The mind is not designed to remain in a prolonged state of unresolved anticipation without rest. This is where many long-term holders misunderstand what is happening to them. They believe they are reassessing the asset, when in reality they are reacting to emotional fatigue. The decision feels analytical, but it is driven by the desire for mental quiet. The market does not need to force anyone out. It only needs to wait until enough participants become tired of carrying uncertainty. Understanding this dynamic does not guarantee success, and it does not imply that any asset must eventually perform. It simply restores awareness. It allows investors to separate emotional signals from structural realities. When exhaustion is recognized for what it is, it loses some of its power. The pressure becomes observable instead of internalized. Long-term outcomes are rarely determined by moments of drama. They are determined by moments of quiet decision-making, often made when motivation is lowest and doubt feels most reasonable. Emotional exhaustion convinces people they are being prudent when they are actually seeking relief. Recognizing this pattern is not about forcing yourself to endure endlessly. It is about ensuring that decisions are made from clarity rather than depletion. In markets, the greatest risk is not being wrong. It is being right too early and leaving too tired. This phase should not be understood as a verdict on the asset or as evidence that something has failed. It functions more like a psychological examination that unfolds slowly and quietly. Markets have a way of testing participants not by confronting them with obvious danger, but by placing them in environments where nothing seems to justify continued patience. When progress feels absent and feedback disappears, the mind begins to search for meaning in the stillness. Doubt grows not because of new facts, but because time itself becomes uncomfortable. This is where many investors misinterpret their own experience, assuming that prolonged uncertainty must mean they were wrong from the beginning. Psychological tests are subtle. They don't announce themselves. They blend into daily routines and emotional habits. At first, waiting feels responsible. Over time, the same waiting begins to feel naive. The shift is not triggered by a specific event, but by accumulated mental strain. The longer the silence lasts, the more the mind fills it with self-questioning. What once felt like conviction gradually starts to feel like stubbornness. This internal narrative changes even though nothing structurally has changed in the market itself. The test is not about information. It is about endurance. Markets repeatedly place participants in situations where emotional strength matters more than intellectual confidence. Most people do not lose because their understanding collapses. They lose because they cannot tolerate the emotional discomfort of being early, uncertain, or out of sync with visible momentum. The human brain is wired to seek resolution. It wants movement, confirmation, and closure. When those things are delayed, the nervous system interprets the delay as a threat, even when no immediate danger exists. This is why sideways conditions feel heavier over time, not lighter. In these moments, impatience begins to masquerade as wisdom. The desire to stop waiting starts to feel like insight. People convince themselves they are adapting, staying flexible, or being realistic, when in fact they are responding to psychological pressure. The market rewards this confusion because it removes participants not through force but through voluntary withdrawal. The test works precisely because it feels self-directed. Short-term thinking thrives in environments where emotion dominates attention. When people feel uncomfortable, they look for action to restore a sense of control. Long-term thinking operates differently. It accepts that discomfort is not always a signal to act. It understands that time spent in uncertainty is part of how markets separate surface-level participation from deep positioning. This is not about stubbornly holding on without thought. It is about recognizing when discomfort comes from internal stress rather than external change. What makes this phase particularly deceptive is that it doesn't feel dramatic. There is no clear moment where the test begins. There is no alarm signaling that patience is being evaluated. The experience blends into everyday life. Checking prices becomes habitual. Doubt becomes familiar. Eventually, exhaustion becomes the background state. At that point, many investors believe they are making a rational reassessment, when in reality they are simply tired of waiting. Understanding that this is a psychological test reframes the entire experience. It shifts the focus away from constant evaluation of outcomes and back toward process and self-awareness. The question becomes less about whether something should have happened by now and more about whether your decision-making environment is being shaped by fatigue or clarity. Markets are indifferent to frustration, but they are highly responsive to behavior. This does not mean endurance guarantees reward. Nothing in markets is guaranteed, but failing the psychological test almost always guarantees regret, because decisions made under exhaustion rarely reflect one's true understanding or original intent. The market's greatest advantage over participants is not superior intelligence or access to information. It is time. Time applies pressure slowly, patiently, and without emotion. When you recognize that this phase is designed to test patience rather than validate conclusions, the pressure begins to loosen. You stop arguing with time and start observing your reactions to it. That awareness alone can restore a sense of control. The test loses its invisibility. And when a test is seen clearly, it no longer silently dictates outcomes. Selling during emotional exhaustion is often mistaken for strategic clarity, but in reality it is usually an attempt to restore internal calm rather than improve long-term outcomes. When uncertainty lingers for too long, the nervous system begins to crave resolution more than accuracy. The mind shifts from asking whether a decision aligns with structure and understanding to asking which option will make the discomfort stop. In that state, selling feels clean, decisive, and responsible, not because the market has changed, but because the emotional load has become too heavy to carry. This is why such decisions rarely feel impulsive. They feel considered. They feel justified. People tell themselves they are being rational, reducing risk, or reallocating intelligently. Yet beneath those explanations is a simpler truth. Emotional relief is being prioritized over strategic positioning. The market does not punish this behavior immediately. Often nothing dramatic happens right after the exit. That delay reinforces the belief that the decision was correct. But over longer cycles, this pattern consistently removes participants just before conditions begin to shift. Emotional regulation and investment strategy are deeply intertwined, even though they are rarely discussed together. When emotional capacity is depleted, even well-reasoned frameworks begin to collapse. The brain seeks certainty, not truth. It seeks an end attention, not an optimal outcome. This is why exhaustion is so effective at pushing people out of positions they once believed in. It bypasses debate. It doesn't argue against the thesis. It simply makes the cost of holding feel intolerable. Markets quietly rely on this dynamic. They don't need to convince anyone that an asset has failed. They only need to create an environment where holding becomes psychologically uncomfortable. Over time, the emotional discomfort grows louder than logic. This is how opportunity moves from those who are emotionally reactive to those who are emotionally regulated. Not through deception, but through asymmetry in patience. What makes selling during exhaustion particularly dangerous is that it often occurs after the hardest part has already been endured. The waiting has already happened, the uncertainty has already been carried, yet the exit happens just as the emotional cost peaks. This is not because the market is cruel, but because human tolerance has limits. Those limits are predictable, and markets tend to move when participation thins, not when confidence is high. Relief-based decisions are seductive because they offer immediate feedback. The moment the position is closed, the mind relaxes, the noise fades, the constant monitoring stops. That calm is mistaken for wisdom, but calm achieved through avoidance is fragile. It depends on staying disengaged. If the market later moves in the direction once anticipated, that calm turns into self-doubt and regret. The pain returns, just in a different form. This pattern repeats across cycles and assets. It has nothing to do with intelligence or experience. Highly informed individuals fall into it just as often as beginners. Knowledge does not protect against nervous system overload. Only awareness does. Recognizing when a decision is being driven by exhaustion rather than insight creates space between feeling and action. In that space, choice becomes clearer. This does not mean one must endure indefinitely or ignore changing realities. Markets do evolve, and reassessment is always necessary. But reassessment under exhaustion is compromised. It compresses time horizons and amplifies short-term discomfort. It frames patience as risk and relief as prudence. That inversion is the hallmark of emotionally driven exits. Long-term positioning requires more than conviction. It requires the ability to remain neutral in emotionally charged environments. It requires understanding that the urge to act is not always a signal of opportunity, but often a signal of fatigue. When this is understood, urgency loses its authority. Decisions slow down. Perspective returns. Selling to escape discomfort is not failure, but it is rarely alignment. The market's greatest advantage is not volatility, but endurance. It waits for the moment when the desire for relief outweighs the desire for participation. Those who recognize this dynamic don't need to rush to do anything. They simply stop mistaking exhaustion for insight, and in doing so, they regain control over their choices. There is a fundamental difference between how short-term retail psychology and long-term capital psychology operate, and that difference becomes most visible during long, uneventful market phases. Short-term thinking looks for stimulation. It needs movement to feel engaged and confirmation to feel safe. When price is active, emotions feel justified. When price is quiet, attention drifts and doubt fills the space. Long-term capital, on the other hand, is not guided by the need for emotional feedback. It is guided by structure, positioning, and time. This contrast is not about intelligence or access to information. It is about temperament. Retail psychology is reactive by design. It responds to what is visible and immediate. When nothing appears to be happening, it assumes nothing is happening at all. Silence is interpreted as weakness. Boredom is interpreted as failure. This mindset struggles in environments where progress is slow and nonlinear because it expects effort to be rewarded quickly. When that reward does not arrive, frustration builds and confidence erodes. The longer the waiting period lasts, the more likely short-term thinkers are to abandon positions, not because their reasoning collapsed, but because their emotional needs are no longer being met. Long-term capital operates on a different clock. It does not require constant validation. It understands that markets spend more time preparing than performing. Accumulation and positioning often occur when sentiment is dull and narratives feel discouraging. Confidence is not drawn from price action, but from understanding cycles, incentives, and structural development. This kind of thinking is comfortable with invisibility. It accepts that meaningful change often happens beneath the surf, long before it becomes visible to the broader market. This difference explains why excitement and consensus rarely mark the beginning of major moves. By the time enthusiasm is widespread, much of the positioning has already occurred. Short-term participants enter when confidence feels safe and shared. Long-term participants enter when confidence feels lonely and uncertain. This is not because they enjoy discomfort, but because they understand that comfort is usually priced in periods of prolonged sideways movement. This psychological gap widens. Retail participants feel ignored by the market. They feel as though their patience is being taken for granted. Long-term capital feels unpressured. Time works in its favor. It does not need to explain itself daily. It does not need reassurance from price. It can afford to wait because it has aligned itself with structure rather than sensation. Wealth is built quietly because loud environments are crowded. When everyone is paying attention, opportunity is diluted. Quiet environments feel empty, but that emptiness is what allows positioning to happen without competition. This is why long-term capital is often most active when participation is low and interest is fading. The absence of noise is not a warning sign. It is often a prerequisite. Retail psychology often underestimates the cost of constant engagement. Watching every move, reacting to every narrative, and measuring success in short intervals drains emotional energy. Over time, this creates a sense of urgency that does not come from the market, but from internal stress. Long-term capital avoids this trap by reducing exposure to noise. It preserves emotional clarity by not demanding that the market entertain it. The contrast is not moral or personal, it is structural. Short-term thinking prioritizes feeling right. Long-term thinking prioritizes being positio. Ned. One seeks validation, the other seeks alignment. One responds to price, the other waits for price to respond. Understanding this difference does not require adopting extreme patience or ignoring reality. It simply requires recognizing which mindset is driving decisions at any given moment. When boredom feels unbearable, it is usually short-term psychology speaking. When waiting feels acceptable, even if uncomfortable, long-term psychology is at work. Markets do not reward those who need constant affirmation. They reward those who can remain steady when affirmation is absent. This is why wealth accumulation rarely feels exciting while it is happening. It feels quiet, uncertain, and often unrewarded in the short term. Only later does it appear obvious. The difference between the two psychologies is not what they know, but how they behave when nothing seems to be happening. One of the most misunderstood aspects of markets is the role of price itself. Many investors treat price as the starting point, the signal that explains everything else. When price does not move, they assume nothing is changing. When price moves suddenly, they assume something important has just happened. In reality, price is usually the final expression of a much longer process. It reacts to forces that have already been in motion for a long time. By the time price becomes visible and exciting, most of the underlying work has already been done. Before price can move meaningfully, positioning has to occur. Capital must decide where it wants exposure, and that decision is rarely driven by daily charts. It is driven by structure, incentives, and long-term expectations. Infrastructure develops quietly. Systems are tested and refined without public celebration. Regulatory clarity, even when slow and uneven, tends to evolve behind closed doors rather than on social media. Liquidity shifts do not announce themselves, they flow gradually, responding to stress, opportunity, and rebalancing needs across the broader financial system. All of this happens long before price reflects it. This is why markets can feel frustrating during preparation phases. Participants are watching the last variable in the chain and waiting for it to justify their patience. When it does not, they assume the entire chain is broken. But price is not a leader, it is a follower. It follows readiness, it follows alignment. It follows conditions that have already matured enough to express themselves visibly. Understanding this changes how waiting feels. Instead of interpreting stillness as stagnation, it becomes possible to see it as incubation. Not every period of quiet is meaningful, but meaningful change almost always includes long periods of quiet. Structural shifts require coordination across many layers of the system. They cannot move at the speed of individual emotion. They move at the speed of institutions, regulation, capital flows, and global incentives. Expecting price to reflect that instantly is a misunderstanding of how markets function. Short-term participants often experience this gap as disappointment. They expect price to validate their understanding quickly. When it doesn't, confidence weakens. Long-term participants understand that validation is delayed by design. They do not look to price for constant reassurance. They look to whether the broader conditions that would eventually justify repricing are forming. This does not mean price will always move in a desired direction or that every quiet phase leads to appreciation. It means that price alone is an incomplete narrative. When price becomes the sole focus, perception narrows. Emotion intensifies. Every small move feels meaningful because there is nothing else to anchor attention. This is where frustration grows, and impatience takes over. Markets reward those who can hold a wider frame. Those who understand that the most important developments often feel invisible while they are happening. That invisibility is uncomfortable because it offers no feedback. It demands trust in process rather than reaction to outcome. Most participants are not trained for this. They are conditioned to respond to what they can see, measure, and discuss daily. When price finally does move, it often surprises those who left early. They assume the movement came out of nowhere, when in reality it was the result of pressures that had been building for a long time. Preparation phases rarely look impressive in real time. They look like nothing, and nothing is difficult to hold. Recognizing that price is the last thing to move restores perspective. It reduces the emotional charge of daily fluctuations. It shifts focus away from constant evaluation and toward understanding broader dynamics. This does not eliminate uncertainty, but it contextualizes it. Waiting stops feeling like wasted time and starts feeling like part of a sequence. Markets do not operate on the rhythm of individual expectations. They operate on the rhythm of systems. Price speaks last, not first. And when that is understood, silence no longer feels like a verdict. It feels like a pause before expression, one that tests patience not because it is cruel, but because it is structural. Periods like this have historically been the environments where wealth quietly changes hands, not through dramatic events, but through gradual shifts in participation. When markets feel dull, discouraging, or emotionally draining, many individuals step away not because they have concluded something new, but because they no longer want to feel uncertain. At the same time, patient participants with longer time horizons remain, not out of excitement, out of understanding. This is how wealth transfer occurs, not through force or deception, but through differences in emotional tolerance. Emotionally reactive participants tend to respond to how the market makes them feel, rather than what it is structurally doing. When sentiment is negative or indifferent, they interpret it as a warning. When interest fades, they assume opportunity has passed. This reaction is natural, but it is also predictable. Markets move capital from those who need emotional comfort to those who can operate without it. The process is slow enough that it feels voluntary. No one is pushed. People leave when they are ready to stop feeling uncomfortable. Patient participants approach these same environments differently. They do not need constant stimulation or reassurance. They understand that sentiment and participation ebb and flow, and that low enthusiasm often precedes revaluation rather than prevents it. Their advantage is not superior foresight, but emotional stability. They are not immune to doubt, but they do not allow doubt to dictate timing. This allows them to remain present while others disengage. Wealth transfer is not a moral judgment. It does not mean one group deserves more than another. It simply reflects behavioral asymmetry. Those who react quickly provide liquidity to those who move slowly. Those who seek resolution provide opportunity to those who accept uncertainty. This dynamic repeats across cycles, markets, and assets because it is rooted in human behavior, not specific circumstances. One of the most difficult aspects of this process is that it does not feel like a transfer while it is happening. It feels like stagnation. It feels like abandonment. It feels like nothing. Participation declines quietly. Conversation fades. Attention moves elsewhere. This thinning of engagement creates conditions where positioning becomes easier and less competitive. The absence of urgency is not a sign that opportunity is gone. It is often a sign that the environment is changing hands. Emotionally reactive decisions compress time. They prioritize immediate comfort over long-term alignment. Patient decisions expand time. They allow outcomes to unfold without forcing them. This difference in time horizon is what ultimately separates outcomes. Markets reward those who can wait without demanding validation. They are indifferent to how strongly someone feels in the moment. This does not mean patience guarantees success. Markets remain uncertain and outcomes are never assured. But impatience almost always guarantees participation at suboptimal moments. Acting when emotional pressure is highest tends to coincide with moments when opportunity is quietly shifting away from those who are leaving. Understanding wealth transfer in this way removes some of the personal sting from difficult market phases. It reframes discouragement as part of a larger cycle rather than a personal failure. It helps explain why markets so often feel hardest just before conditions begin to change. The difficulty is not accidental, it is functional. When investors learn to recognize this environment for what it is, they gain the ability to slow down internally even if the market remains quiet. They stop interpreting emotional discomfort as a signal to act. They begin to see it as information about their own state rather than the market's direction. Wealth transfer does not announce itself. It happens in silence, during periods when few are paying attention and many are losing interest. Those who remain calm, reduce reactivity, and maintain perspective are not guaranteed outcomes, but they preserve optionality. They stay in control of their decisions rather than surrendering them to fatigue or frustration. In markets, that composure is often the most valuable position of all.